On this episode, we're taking a deep dive into the world of strength, mobility, injury, and the groundbreaking training concepts that are changing the game from everyone from professional athletes to everyday people who just want to move without pain. I'm joined by one of my favorite coaches, Strange Grayson. And in this conversation, we get into our shared path of hitting rock bottom with chronic and acute injuries. We discuss the frustration as lifetime athletes and the limitations we hit using traditional approaches to strength and conditioning, and what a few conceptual shifts did to open up the world of fitness and allowed us to feel capable again. Grayson has a diverse background, but what stands out are his creative strength sessions and mind-bending mobility. From a 400-pound plus Zerker deadlift to back tucks and backyard sprints, his training looks creative and engaging. His mixture of golden age strongman efforts and modern experimentations in mobility make him one of my go-to sources when looking for training inspiration. If you watch his stuff and wonder, how can I learn to move and perform like that? This episode is for you, as it covers the main principles and approach that he uses. We'll explore how we discovered the world of functional range conditioning, or FRC, and how it shattered our long-held beliefs about training. We get into the nitty-gritty of why our perfect deadlift technique might still be setting us up for injury, and why the grind harder mentality is not a roadmap to longevity. You'll hear Grayson describe his matrix moment of realizing that our bodies are full of untrained holes despite being able to lift hundreds of pounds. He helps me assess my plan for rehabbing a bicep tear to come back better than what it was before the injury. We discuss the crucial difference between training muscles and the often neglected connective tissues and why it's the key to longevity. We talk about the concept of strength as a sensitivity and how this allows you to listen to your body's whispers before they become deafening screams of injury. And finally, why we believe that true fitness is an infinite game of creativity and exploration and not a finite race to lift heavier. So whether you're a CrossFitter, a powerlifter, Jiu-Jitsu practitioner, or just somebody tired of feeling fragile, this conversation will give you a new framework for thinking about your body, your training, and your long-term health. Get ready to question everything you thought you knew about getting strong and staying strong. Buckle up. Welcome to the Unfucked Podcast. My name is Michael Blevins. I've been training some of the world's most elite performers for over 15 years, from iconic actors and athletes to soldiers and CEOs. I'm an entrepreneur, an athlete, and an obsessive when it comes to human behavior.
Man looks in the abyss. There's nothing staring back at him. At that moment, man finds his character. And that is what keeps him out of the abyss. I think I understand.
How's your day going?
It's going, just the usual. It's I actually had a PT today, going to see the occupational therapist, which is always interesting, if you've done any of these like major injuries. So it'll be cool to get into it. But I've wanted to talk to you. Obviously, we've been going back and forth for years now. You're kind of who, I guess, who turned me on to, well, not necessarily turned me on to, but really like solidified the interest in FRC and some of these like different training styles. I think I originally asked you, like, should I just learn from you, or should I go to FRC the cert? And you were like, it's a lot easier just to go to the cert and then answer any like hard questions later. So that turned out to be really good advice. I kind of took off with a lot of the concepts and ended up doing ISM last year sometime, and
Nice.
really kind of, I think that really solidified, honestly, a lot of the questions that I had about it. And like, I take a bunch of inspiration for what you're doing, because maybe I'm wrong, but you just explore quite a bit. You do a lot of creativity in the way that you put things together. Am I right?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that was one of the best things about it, was like breaking me out of that cycle of just having to repeat the same patterns over and over again. And just being like, oh, there is like all this other shit out there that I could be training that I've never even thought about training, let alone like felt in my body, like that was, it was cool. And then I was like, oh, there's a lot of holes there. Quite fragile, it turns out.
Well, I mean, I would say later, it just turns out that I'm untrained. I think that's like a really that's kind of been, maybe I'll use that term as like what has encompassed the big shift that I made. It's not, and it's come from like observing probably the biggest frustration that I think anybody faces when, you know, you're obviously into CrossFit, lifting weights, powerlifting, all that stuff. And you're like, I'm strong. Like I can pull 500 pounds off the ground, and I'll never need to do that. And you know, hopefully, you know, it's like the buddy system. If anything's over 200 pounds, kind of deal.
Absolutely.
But you definitely, like, at this point where you can lift massive amount of weight, you're a sneeze away from a back problem or
Right.
whatever. And I think I faced that so many times. You know, I've only hurt myself lifting a few times. Like the biggest injury that I got that wasn't like a catastrophic, but some of these like more annoying kind of intramuscular nerve related issues. Like most low back issues are not like acute. They're usually like dysfunction or a tweak or something like that. And it feels nervy, so it's different. But one of the worst ones I had from that was not lifting, although probably lifting put me into the position that I was eventually hurt because it just compounded the force. I was just like stretching my back, you know, doing like a back, or I was just like trying to remain mobile, and I do a lot of tumbling, and I was just like threw my feet over my head, and kind of like a, you know, you know, something you would see in jiu-jitsu all the time. And I felt something would kind of tweak. And so I, you know, like you do, like if you feel something weird, you go try to feel it closer. And I couldn't get off the ground. Like I was legitimately in the worst position. I mean, I had to go to the hospital, get muscle relaxers. And that's really what solidified my like misunderstanding. I was like, okay, I don't know that much about physiology because I am totally healthy. I didn't do anything wrong. My technique, I mean, I say this quite a bit, like my technique is pretty damn good. Like I've always felt like there's something, even in perfect technique, there's something incorrect that happens, right? Like you over contract or some kind of issue. So that started kind of this questioning of like, okay, like you can't CrossFit forever. You know, you're not going to be there. There's not really good examples of like lifelong power lifters, you know, at least the longevity of that life is like, it's very, very short. So, I was looking for something because I had originally, and this is kind of how I found your stuff, I just kept looking for questions on shoulder injuries connected to back injuries because I had got a back injury, just a tweak, it went away, but then I got a shoulder injury. Like, and you know, nothing drastic, but probably just an aggressive strain or something. And I couldn't get into this like snatch position anymore. And therefore it just started cascading. Like the whole thing started falling apart. You know, the snatch just started dive bombing. And I like, my personality was built on being able to snatch, you know, 280 pounds. So I'm like, oh shit, I guess this is getting old. So I'm gonna have to contend with this. So I just like let it kind of degrade, but I started looking. And I found some stuff on FRC, found your stuff. Not a lot of it made sense to start. I was like, what are they doing? Like the Pale and Rail. I was like, I have no idea. And I had heard of cars through Somner's stuff, doing gymnastics years ago, but different. But he was very much into that controlled articular rotations. So me and Aaron, my wife, went on a trip to Greece. We stayed at this house. I had no access to any training equipment. So I was just stuck at this house, and I was like, oh, I'll just play with, like, I can go for runs and stuff, but why don't I just play with this new mobility stuff since, you know, there's a pool, the sun's out. I don't want to really do anything. So every day I would go through and watch videos, do the car. Okay. Then I would do like what I thought was a Pale and Rail. I got a little bit wrong, but I was, you know, trying to conceptualize what was happening. And because I was still of the mindset that something had to move, I was doing a bunch of banded work, thinking that was the same thing. Well, on the 10th day, I like put my arm over my head and I was like, oh shit, my shoulder doesn't hurt. And I was like, oh, it doesn't hurt. Like it's better. And I was like, okay, I did something correct. But I immediately flew back, talked to you, went back and booked an FRC and got that taken care of. So that was kind of on, you know, my background with it. What do you want to share kind of how you got involved in this? Because I'm super interested to see how similar our paths are.
Yeah, they actually sound quite similar up to finding FRC. Yeah, I mean, at the at the time when we found FRC, we had owned a CrossFit gym in Denver. We had kind of had a falling out with our business partners, so we had moved to California, and we were both, Sarah and I were coaching at NorCal Strength and Conditioning, and you know, they were like big time CrossFit for a long time, but had gone away from CrossFit because they just felt like it was churning too many people through the machine, and you know, it wasn't sustainable. So I mean, we had already kind of had that concept of like, let's do some stuff that's longevity minded. That's how we found Christopher Summers stuff. And, you know, like he was really the first person I heard about talking about connective tissue training. Like, you got to train the connective tissue. And I was like, well, I just lift weights, bro. It can't be that hard. And at that, you know, at that time, let's see, that was like, we moved there in 2013. And that was, you know, I was like, I just turned 30. I was throwing my back out in very similar fashion. Like, rarely was it working out, but it might be like a 500-pound deadlift day the next day. I actually remember the specific time that was the worst. Like you were talking about, Sarah was as close to 9 months pregnant as you could get. And we were moving. We had to get out of our house because we just bought a house. And it was like, all right, let's pack the house up today. I went outside to get a cardboard box, and then she didn't see me again because I was laying on the ground because I had thrown my back out lifting up this empty cardboard box. And I was like crippled. Like, there was no getting me up. You couldn't have somebody come pick me up because it was so painful. And so there was that, you know, like, left shoulder from snatching was always cranky. And I started seeing some FRC posts on Instagram, and I was like, man, that's some crazy stuff. Like, what is all this stuff? And we just kind of started scratching the surface and getting more curious about it. And then we just were like, let's just sign up for the certification and see what it's about. And then I went there, and it was like that Matrix moment, you know, where you're like, oh, wow. I mean, one, it showed me a lot of like how incapable my body was at certain things that it should be capable of to do CrossFit stuff, to lift like that. And I was like, well, that really makes sense when my back hurts. That makes sense why it hurts when I hang on the pull-up bar. I mean, all these things. And thinking about clients, you know, like I have this group of clients that does pull-ups and their shoulders feel great and they're getting stronger. And like this group just complains about their shoulders hurting and they're not getting stronger at pull-ups, and we're all doing the same pull-ups. I don't understand that. So it really connected those dots. And then, I mean, it was sort of like, after that, we just continued on that journey. Like, I will say the most challenging part in the beginning was just kind of getting people bought into it. You know, like we went there, we got that this is a really good approach. Let's start doing this stuff. And it was, the resistance was crazy in the beginning. They're like, we're not going to do push-ups to warm up anymore. We're like, we're going to do push-ups later. We're going to do some stuff for your shoulder that's not a push-up. And they're like, I don't see how this is going to help me. Can't I just do more push-ups? And we're like, yes, but we've been doing the same thing for so long and your shoulders don't feel good. There's something else out there. And then, you know, so then like that gym got taken over by somebody that we didn't really jive with. We didn't want to work for them. That's how we started Basis. So we had a gym in California, and that the whole concept there was really like, let's just use these FRC principles across all of the classes that we're doing. And so we kind of had that joint and tissue perspective applied to just regular stuff. So we're doing some strongman, you know, some very scaled down CrossFit, and then like heart rate monitored conditioning. But it was really cool because, you know, we'd had this group of people that we'd been working with for a long time who we were aware of their problems. We were aware of all the things that they were trying to avoid. And that's what we sort of realized at one point, where it was like, we're just living in this land of avoidance. Like, I know that you can't really deadlift because that always pisses your back off. So we'll do a million other exercises that sort of resemble a hinge to not upset your back. And then we have all these people that we've been doing that with for like 4 years at that point, who are like, oh, dude, I'm deadlifting again. My back feels awesome. I'm doing pull-ups again. My shoulders feel great. And they're like, okay, well, we're not making this up. We're not deluding ourselves that we really feel better. Like, it's also working on all these other people. Let's just keep, you know, uncovering this stuff. So
I think that's man, it's so good to hear too, because I think the buy-in thing for us was pretty rough as well. Not for me, like I'll incorporate anything that works. And I think the reason why we were open to it ourselves, obviously, is because I'm always looking for new things to like throw in. In fact, the whole premise of our like training program, the online stuff, all of that has to just do with like creativity. Like, I really do think that's the foundation of pretty much anything. You have to be really curious in order to develop something. You got to have consistency and some repetition in there, obviously, to get good at anything. But in reality, it's more like each day is like, I wonder what I can do today. Like, I wonder, you know, that really tends to highlight pretty much every session. And to be fair, a lot of the days, man, you don't feel like doing the thing that you need to do. And I think that's okay too.
Sure.
But our clients had something very, very similar where they're like, well, I just do more of the thing that hasn't worked. And you're like,
Yeah.
and I think this is fascinating now. Okay, like 30,000 foot view now that I'm out of it to a degree, but I do hear like a lot of coaches, a lot of friends that are really successful, weightlifters and powerlifters and CrossFitters, and they talk, endlessly about how you just have to grind, you just have to keep going. And also, you see where they end up, and you go, "Man, that's really not a good roadmap unless you want to be crippled." And this is something I struggle with, but I really do think that the ISM really revealed this because they really went deeper into accommodation. And I think that was,
Yeah.
I went back and read a lot of the original literature. Funny enough, I read it when I was like 22. Verkochansky, Principles of Strength Training,
Yeah.
Zatsiorsky. The interesting thing is, it's like I I skipped past everything that they already knew that we just had to relearn through FRC, and I went straight to what people want because I want to get strong fast. So I jumped to like the peaking programs, the 5x3s, the 6x2s, the 7x1s, dynamic overload, the conjugate system. And I went right to that because I wanted so badly to impress people, right? That you like skip a bunch of steps. And rereading it, I go reread it, and it's like the first page is like accommodation, definition. This is the biggest problem that the Soviets had to try to solve, and they were
Right.
never completely successful. So I've spent the past couple of years kind of remapping. We talked a little bit ago, and I mentioned like the interesting thing about the ISM, the internal strength model, is years ago, 2000, I want to say 2019, I published something called a strength manual. And it was my attempt to kind of like, I wasn't too concerned with reps and sets at that point,
Yeah.
I was already over that. But I did want to give people some like different aspect of how I think of strength training. So we kind of redefined it in essence. And in defining it, I came up with some really interesting things, and this has evolved since. But in writing this manual, it took me about 2 years to write this thing with my friend Keegan Dillon, who's a power lifter, great coach, really close friend. And we just worked on this thing back and forth, bouncing ideas and really trying to reconceptualize why we think the traditional approach to strength training is garbage. And so in 2019, we published this thing, and in there, I said, I have a vision for how strength is initiated internally, right? And the reason I was saying that is because like there's something happening in the joint that I see that happens with gymnasts where they can lock down a joint, and that seems to be probably the purest form of strength. And at this time, I didn't use the word, but I would use it now as strength expression.
Yeah.
And I just left it there because I was like, I just, maybe one day I'll figure it out. Maybe one day this thing, but it really seems like an internal driver as opposed to an external force. So on the subtext and I can send you original manual that's just so you can kind of laugh at it because there's some like
Yeah.
ridiculous things in there, but also some really like clever insights. The premise for the whole book said, you really need to push against something until you can push yourself from inside. Right. So when I went to FRC, I was like, oh, shit, they figured it out. Like, they
Yeah.
did it. They answered this premise.
Your head was there though. That's so cool, man.
It was in the right spot, and we're moving
Yeah.
in the right direction. I've been trying to revise that strength manual now for 2 years, and it just took a complete rewrite. Like I just ended up just rewriting the whole thing because it deserves a rewrite. But it's been a
Sure.
really phenomenal approach to this stuff. Now, that being said, I was developing the program, and not like a list of exercises to do because I think we're beyond that, but a list of concepts that people could use to organize their own training. That essentially would be the quote unquote program. And in doing so, I was really looking at myself and how I would go through strength training now. So I've been messing with a lot of ideas, and I think like in experimenting heavily, I probably overloaded my biceps quite a bit in the weeks working up to when it actually snapped. And then the conditions around where it snapped were I had spent I don't know, I probably had like 6 sessions that were not intelligently spaced because I was really trying to figure out what the best stimulus was in trying to figure out the phasing for developing a weakness. Now, what I mean is, like, if you phase a squat out, it starts with an eccentric, then goes isometric, and then concentric. But if you phase a deadlift, it's a concentric, isometric, eccentric. And I think what they show, and I was messing with this idea, is like if I start with an isometric and then move to an eccentric, Cal Dietz would say that this makes the tissue very slow. And I was trying to understand that concept by messing with it. And if you go eccentric, then into isometric, then concentric, then it makes the tissue explosive. And I was really trying to just like apply what he was saying to the tissue. So that being said, it resulted in these pull-up variations that I was messing with, which got a little bit out of hand because they were all to absolute failure. They were miserable. And I didn't, and then on top of that, we're doing like constant tension, bicep curls, and all these different angles. I did miss something, and I'll bring that up in a little bit. But then I was in Spain, and we're at this really great event called the Mallorca BJJ Fest.
Oh, I saw that on Instagram.
Yeah, great instructors, man. Like Hodger Gracie has been there. John Thomas goes there. Raspberry Ape. All these like really good thinkers show up, and they just like for a week you have them, right? You can roll with them. That they're like I've been going there for a couple of years now, and now they ask to help and instruct on like the fitness side of it.
Sweet.
So I was there rolling, and we're drilling, and this guy kind of like stepped. I was pulling like like reverse De La Riva, where you kind of trap your arm,
Sure.
and he was getting pretty flustered. And he stepped, and he went to go step, like kind of like a staple on a bicep with the arch of his foot, except he missed and kind of like dug his heel right into my ulnar process and right on the humeral head. And it bruised immediately. Like I was like, that's going to hurt. But I didn't think anything of it because jiu-jitsu, your shins are all bruised up. It's not like a big deal.
Yeah.
And that's all I thought of it. But it did feel tight. Like it felt like, man, like a hematoma, like immediately.
Yeah.
And I didn't really think about where he stepped or what he did, but I had to hurry and go teach a class. And in this class, I was teaching about like a very simple concept of increasing mobility and driving real strength adaptation. And somebody asked me, they were like, like show me the pull-up again. And I jumped up, and there was like light in my eye, and I missed the pull-up bar, and then I went to go grab it, and it just accelerated right on that arm, and it just like
right away,
came right off the bone. And I like, what's weird is I didn't feel it, right? I heard it, and then I looked down, and I felt it crawl up my arm as it like retracted off the distal head, and I was like, holy shit, I just tore my bicep. That is so weird. And that's all I could think was like, it didn't feel like a maximal force even. It was just a weird force. Like because I was missing, I was turning into supination to try to grab the bar and then falling on it. And so I've thought about it a lot about, obviously it's probably just a freak accident. But my tissue was probably under recovered, and from the training we're doing. And when I really think about it, I'll do dynamic overload stuff in flexion and extension for, rotational capacity for the shoulder, like tons of those slingshots for kind of external rotation to protect against Americanas and Kimura defense, tons of slingshots going the other way, tons of snapbacks with like the top of shoulder flexion. I've never done that for the bicep. Like I've never done accelerated, what would replicate the force that was on it. So it got me thinking like, holy shit, training is so specific. You know what I mean? Like even in this case, like you're off by a millimeter and the tissue will just explode, especially if I think this is a big mistake, and maybe you can comment on this. I have a lot of confidence in my tissue. It feels really good. And therefore, this is the mistake I see a lot of people make when they can deadlift 600 pounds. They have 600-pound confidence. but they turn 1 millimeter to the right, and then they're untrained essentially. So the premise I've been setting in my head to teach other people this concept, which I kind of fell victim to a very narrow degree, is like, if you've got a 350-pound clean, and you have a ritualistic setup. I know you do, because you've cleaned and you've done all this stuff. Like the first joint in my thumb goes on the line of the knurling, and that dictates the space, right? And I only like a 26.5 millimeter bar. Like that's all I'll use. And I don't like center knurling because I don't like the aggressive abrasion on the neck.
Collarbones, yeah.
And my shoelace will line up with the front line of the bar. And so you're like, my spacing is always the same. Everything's the same. Now, if I can, my best power clean is probably like 335 or something.
Nice.
And if I think about that, if I move my hand even a centimeter out and I turn my left foot, 10 degrees out, that would probably drop 50 pounds off my clean. Just by, you know what I mean? And you go, okay,
sure.
So only in very narrow circumstances can I produce this kind of power and this kind of contraction rate. So that's what I was telling other people about why it's so important to mix exercise and really not specialize unless you're specializing. Like if you're a weightlifter, don't listen to me. Do weightlifting. That is your skill. That's your sport. And you're making sacrifices logically so that you can express something to a very limited, to a very high degree, but very limited, narrow expression. And in my thinking, I'm just like, how specific are we talking when we're talking? Like when you think about this, we just kind of agree on the same system works, and we're applying the same, rules of thumb. What is the crossover for you when you're training tissue? Where do you see that it has to be so specific and not so specific?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think you could probably drive yourself insane with the pursuit of specificity in that. And like outside of it making you feel crazy, you would probably do well for kind of injury resistancing yourself, if that's such a thing. Like there's no injury proofing, but we could be more resilient. Going back to like where your bicep tore. I mean, I think for a long time, I always was under the impression of like these injuries happen in extremes, right? Like if my elbow gets extended all the way into full extension, that's where it's going to be most vulnerable. I never thought about the idea of just like your muscle cells are contracting and the connective tissue is dissipating that contraction. And so I could tear my bicep mid-range here in a specific angle, right? It could happen anywhere. Wherever the load exceeds whatever that connective tissue can dissipate, the tissue yields. And so then I have a tear there. But even going back to the technique thing, like if I used to teach that like crazy. If you use good technique, you're never going to hurt yourself because good technique is this magical safety blanket. But again, it depends. Like me doing what looked like a perfect deadlift would throw my back out because me holding a neutral spine was like within 1 millimeter of my maximal spine extension. So I was just doing a lot of loading, operating very close to my limit of spine motion, which makes sense why it would get pissed off, despite it looking like a good deadlift. I think when it comes to like that component, like every angle change that we have at every joint, and when we're doing a multi-joint movement, there's, how many infinite positions can we create with that? Like we're biasing different tissues. So to account for all that with training and make it all able to tolerate the same amount of force, that's like a deep, dark hole that we'll probably never get out of, even if we could live multiple lifetimes training. I think the way that I've kind of dealt with that in my own training with other people is like, and really probably this whole concept just being applied to FRC that we sort of figured out with just doing it is like really discussing the internal feelings that people are having while they're training. Like in the beginning doing FRC stuff, it was very much focused on like, this is what this setup looks like to train internal rotation. I'm doing a sleeper stretch. You're gonna get on your side. You're gonna push down on your arm. You're gonna resist. And we're going through, these are the actions that you're doing. There was no discussion on where do you actually feel that when you do that? Do you feel that in your, if we're trying to push down and resist, ideally I'm contracting my shoulder external rotators. Do you happen to feel your external rotators in your shoulder? Maybe you just feel a pinch in the front of the shoulder. We just weren't talking about that. And I don't think they have time to go over all those details in the FRC certifications. But what we've kind of shifted to is like, that makes the majority of the training is this discussion on what things feel like when you load them at a certain angle, at a certain rate, where you're feeling it. That's probably the best indication of what stuff needs more training. So if we were like, let's figure out a way that we can make this bicep really resilient, figuring out how you're, maybe just use the example of like full extension, but thinking about and feeling out where you feel the most significant tension in your bicep. Is that when it's pronated and you're resisting extension? Is it supinated? Is it some weird angle in the middle? Does that change from being like a full length bicep stretch to when I change into this angle of pronation, now it becomes this very acute line right down at the, crossing my elbow or something like that. And talking about, the feelings that we maybe would want to have in that tissue at end range versus what you might be feeling. I think that can really help you narrow down at least the areas that are the biggest priorities to deal with, just based on how the tissue behaves under load and passive stretching, rapid loading, all that stuff. So I try to use that because of all of the potential angles that you can get into. That feels really overwhelming. But if I want to be specific, think about those positions, and then I basically start just trying to narrow it down by what it feels like when I do different kinds of loading. I think that's the best way that I found to go through it.
Yeah, that's it. So you're looking for, oh no, hey. So you're basically looking for vulnerabilities, like the most likely, and you're basing that off of the tension. You mentioned something really interesting, which in my head I've kind of worked this out because I thought the same as you. Like the tissue would be brought to the end range of motion, especially when, like to back up a little bit, I didn't tear at the muscle. I tore at the connective tissue, right? The tendon is what tore. So that is actually what was weak. And I have this conversation with a lot of people. It just seems weird. I mean, I know off the top of my head, within the last month, 5 other people that have distal head tears. Really strange. I commented on Greg Souders because I was like, saw the brace and I was like, distal head. I don't know how he didn't reveal how it was torn, but most people assume that it's at full extension, and then layered on with some kind of, probably, I'm guessing, supination or pronation. Pronation is a little bit tighter for me, but some people are tighter the other way. That didn't happen. And this is what made me think, that's why I go back to the person stepping on my bicep, is because when we went over, especially in the ISM, they really talked about being able to palpate the tissue, right? To feel as it ramps. So for, if we release this for other people, which I think could be really helpful for other people to kind of understand what we're talking about, the connective tissue ramps at a different speed or a different rate than muscle tissue. That's what makes it kind of different, right? It gets a 1-to-1 for every, let's say, centimeter that it stretches. It gets, one measurement of tension. And so what made me think that the bruise was really important was that if the muscle was bruised, a hematoma will take the elasticity out of the muscle, and therefore it will accelerate the ramping onto the connective tissue, which is why if I just jumped on the bar from this angle and slightly supinated it and then accelerated, it had like a deceleration, I should say, that thing would come off just because of the muscle being unable to have elasticity. So it just kind of like advanced the tear further down the road. That's really interesting that, you mentioned it in like what to look for. That probably would have been a red flag if I had done some assessment to really feel where I feel tight. That being said, I probably wouldn't have found it because I'm fairly mobile. There's not many, I have very specific tightnesses that I address, and I think about it a lot like you do. I go, if that's tight, it probably means that the structure is a little bit off. It means like one side is, probably pulling a little bit harder than the other. And I work pretty hard on my training to just try to make those adjustments. Now, I think because we have 40 years of experience of living and beating ourselves up, you're never going to make that right, but we can probably get a little bit closer. So that's a really good kind of like I guess just a signpost for people of like, what should I address? Like, how should I know that I'm vulnerable to injury? And I think if something is tight, it needs attention somewhere. Maybe that summary.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, one thing that FRC made me realize is that like your body gives you a lot of physical feedback, but it gives you a lot of physical feedback at a fairly low level, like things that are easy to ignore. I mean, I think about where I've had problems with my body and what those areas have felt like the things that I usually paid the most attention to was like, oh, I have like a back spasm right now and it feels really bad. But when my back was feeling really good, there was definitely a difference in how that aspect of my back would feel, like going into lumbar flexion or trying to rotate my hip or something like that. There's all these little things that, they're just those more subtle signals that I think are easy to ignore. And if your goal is to train for a long time, I think the more you pay attention to those, the more insight you get. Like your body gives you so much insight that is a whisper in the beginning, and it gets loud, and eventually like, holy shit, my bicep tore, I threw my back out, whatever that is. It's very easy to listen to those, but all the things before that is like, dude, I told you this 5 years ago. You just kept driving, man.
It's such a good way to put it. I have an analogy for this because I think I'm on to a very similar theory as you, as these subtleties, and I also see them in different. I hate this about myself, but also I've been able to connect this with kind of like, the nervous systems. It's not just musculoskeletal. Like there's hormonal and emotional and other waves that run through this process, and they all kind of cross paths. And one of the things that I see is like that you don't understand the language that the body speaks, and you're really, your job as somebody who moves and wants to move well for a long time is to learn that language the best you can. But it's still kind of like talking to your dog. You just like, they look at you, and you go, something's up, and they like move their head a little bit and you go, yeah, they need something. And so you're like, but you're very curious because you care about this organism. And the best way I can kind of put this, that the traditional training has really, and I mean absolutely, ruined its total premise. I really do think. I think that the preparation for specialized sport has absolutely taken human beings off course for like what fitness is actually designed for. And I mean, go back to like the definition of fitness being like the attributes and qualities required for survival, right? Like just fundamental. And we get specialized sport. And first of all, I think the biggest problem is the timeline. Specialized sport and these endeavors that people want, abs by summer, a big bench press by the end of high school, all of these things, they are finite games. And within finite games, they have end dates. And in reality, fitness is this infinite game that we're trying to persist and foster, not find a conclusion to. And I explain it to most people, like, if you come to me looking for fitness, like your, how you would approach the lottery, it's going to turn out the same, right? You're going to be very upset and probably end up bankrupt. Now, if you come to me looking at fitness, how you might develop the relationship with a loved one or a child, foster a child or something like that, you're going to have a very good experience because you're understanding that there's no end date to it. Like, I don't try to get so good at my marriage or raising children that I don't have to do it anymore. And I think we've been convinced by society that that's the arc. If you get so good at this thing, one day you won't have to do it. And that's just a complete left turn from where I think the actual the actual aspects of fitness that are applicable to us take us to. So in that regard, it's kind of like a sidestep, but I really think like the foundation has really allowed me to appreciate this process of figuring things out and identifying sensitivities like what you talked about. That being said, a couple months ago, and I talked about this on the last podcast I did on strength, it's like one of the most revealing things over the past 2 years to me is that strength training separated from
competitive powerlifting and the expressions that most people know in strongman is about sensitivity, right? It really is like you are ramping up your nervous system to be so tolerant of increasing stress that really you need the most sensitive nervous system possible, actually. And to contrast that with how I see most people train, and years ago I probably wouldn't have said anything about this because there's this whole premise about like harden the fuck up, just lift it, just do the thing, shut up legs, kill your inner bitch, be David Goggins. Like all of these things are telling you to numb yourself, but for what? It's like the opposite. Like no, like listen closely and pay attention. So the correlate that I came up with is I was talking to my friend about is like, imagine like an injury is like a bastard stepchild, right? Like you, you don't really want it, right? And you're like, but you're like, it's thrown at you and you have to deal with it. And if you don't, you're kind of a terrible person. So
Right.
there's two options. You can lock that kid in a basement and ignore it, and the signals get louder and more abrupt and more terrible, and the relationship will go down. Or you can really listen. Like you can really try to pay attention and try to understand what this bastard child of an injury needs. And that is really our job. And so that's really been like, since this is the most, I guess, this would probably be the most extreme injury I've gotten since I've really revamped my thought process. And in which case, I think it was really a gift to allow me to apply all of the concepts that I now know into a real life thing. And to be fair, it's paid off, right? Like I think what I know now, I'm ahead of schedule on my recovery, but it doesn't really matter because I talked about this idea, on my website is like, I'm not looking for a timely recovery. I guess I'm not looking for a timely recovery. I'm looking for a timeless recovery, right? Like
Wow.
I want
That's a
this
great
thing
way
to
to say it.
last.
Yeah.
And that is where, the question on the injury myself, maybe I'll just ask you straight up. And then if I have something that's different, I imagine we're probably pretty similar in our approach. But if you were in my position, walk me through like how you would do it.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, maybe I'll talk or start with like, we were kind of talking about like organizing different kinds of contractions. So I always think about like the organization from the FRC perspective of like, what do I need this elbow to do fundamentally? Well, the first thing I need is I need rotation there because that's a visual representation of there's just space between the bones for them to move around. So we need that articular motion there. And so like that's always, to me, I always look at, we start with the fundamental motion thing and then kind of do some assessing to see what that fundamental motion feels like. Like just, if you're actively supinating compared to before the injury, have you lost degrees of freedom for rotation? Maybe not. If you had your elbow out of use for a while, I would imagine there's probably been a loss across the board in some of those capacities. So then I would look at like, okay, if we are looking at rotation, maybe we found there's some missing pronation or supination. What does it feel like if we just do the first thing that joint needs to do, which is basically passive motion, right? Like, how does it feel to passively try to lengthen your pronators or your supinators? Based on those sensations, then we can kind of determine the next step. So I look at, even going back to the connective tissue, the way that it feels when it stretches, like healthy connective tissue kind of gradually builds. So the more length you put into it, the more strain it experiences. So it's sort of like this 45-degree angle of increasing tension gradually. When you run into that connective tissue that is injured or maybe doesn't dissipate force, you get that really big spike. So maybe you're going into a stretch and you get to a certain angle and then a tiny bit more length to that tissue. All of a sudden, there's a really big jump in the strain that you're feeling in that tissue. So we hit that first step. I go, okay, cool. That tissue doesn't even lengthen passively. Like now we just need to spend some time mechanically stretching it and see if that resolves. Go ahead.
Quick question, just because it's really fascinating, and maybe this is something I absolutely don't know the answer to. I do assess tissue kind of similarly to you.
Yeah.
I've never known what to do, and I've adjusted if somebody does not feel anything tight, but you know that it is dysfunctional.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, so I just had an assessment yesterday with a friend with pretty bad like anterior hip pain. He's an endurance athlete. And this was something that for a long time, I struggled when I was working with people because I would, this is off the top of my head, but my feeling is that like 50% of people don't feel a passive stretch. And I always wondered why that was. I was like, is this just an awareness thing? Like maybe it is stretching and you don't feel it, but I don't know if you follow Brian G.
Yeah.
Fox at all.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Awesome. I always think he's like my Obi-Wan Kenobi. Like I've learned so much from that dude over the years. He's amazing. But he was talking about this, like your connective tissue is sort of the tissue that's there to help your nervous system register that there's stuff to stretch. And so he kind of framed it as like, if you don't feel a stretch when tissue is stretching, that could be an indication that you're lacking architecture. Like there isn't enough of that scaffolding there holding the tissue together to even send those signals to your nervous system that tissue is stretching. So, in this hierarchy of like, what do we start with? If I have somebody who they have a limitation, say they're, I want them to have maybe 180 degrees of rotation and they're stopping here, and we want to passively stretch that last little bit of supination. You go into that and they're like, what do you feel there? Like, nothing. I don't feel anything. If that's the case, I'm more concerned with doing stuff that's going to give them sensation of that tissue stretching that isn't passive stretching then. So I always start with more mid-range, low-intensity isometrics to see if we can just get some sensation in the tissue that we do want to stretch. Maybe not even in the range that they need to get it to eventually, but that's where we start. So I look at that as like, we need to go to an input that builds connective tissue architecture. Low-intensity isometrics are one of those that do that. Obviously, there's other things that do that, like passive stretching is one that can increase architecture, but if there isn't enough there to register, then we need to go, I look at like, we got to go back a step and then maybe start loading that in lesser range and see if we can get some of that sensation. And I've had really good success doing that. And then slowly going back in, and maybe it takes a couple of weeks of doing these low intensity isometrics, but all of a sudden you get somebody to go in and they're like, I feel a stretch. I never felt a stretch there before. That's cool. And I say, okay, great. Now we can probably at least get the passive stretch to do the thing that it's supposed to do, which is get that tissue to be better at being passively stretched. There is that other category of, are we dealing with mechanical tension or neurological tightness? Because that also has kind of a different trajectory. Like that, again, this was something in the early days of working with people where I would have somebody do a passive stretch and maybe they did feel a stretch, but over the course of maybe 2 minutes of doing that, they're going, this is getting really uncomfortable. I need to get out of this stretch. And I was like, you're probably too far into it. But that's a really good indication of you're stretching something that maybe isn't restricted mechanically. Maybe it's your nervous system that's doesn't want to let that tissue stretch. You trying to put more passive length into it is actually sending off more of those alarm bells of your nervous system going, fuck, I'm trying to stop this from lengthening. It's being lengthened. I want to pull it back in. So it's creating more tension. So I always use that as well. Like if somebody's doing a passive stretch, I want them to feel the passive stretch. And then I also want to feel that stretching. I want them to feel the stretching sensation dissipate over at least a couple minutes. And if I can't get them to feel it dissipating, I'm thinking maybe I'm not dealing with mechanical tension anymore. Maybe this is just a neurological tightness component.
Yeah, that's a great insight. And it's something that I've thought about, and I think I thought about maybe a little bit similar. Like, maybe the cars are kind of my answer to like, if you can't feel it, do more of them. Like, in this case, like, I think orientation, part of why I think FRC is so phenomenal as like a strength concept is not that the action does something very special. It's that the thought allows you to really like introspect on what I'm doing. And that is the connection neurologically. So I guess that, when I look at things, I'm like, if I'm building, you mentioned, tissue architecture, I think is a great way to put it. I think about the kind of the whole concept to that. To give you a little insight about what I mean, a lot of people think that the architecture, the foundation or strength is kind of the foundation. And I take it one step further and say, the aerobic system is because you need resources. right? Like you need blood and oxygen. You need these things to come. So therefore, like before you can build a house, you need to build a road. And before you can build a road, you need a river. And before you need to dam something. You go back, and you basically like, if I'm really going to do this correctly, let's get flow going. And that kind of leads me into if you're not feeling something, the electricity is off. And therefore we back up and just look at it, are we missing resources? Are we missing electricity? Or are we missing foundational things? That I really liked how you put that. I'll probably think about that for days about, things that I've missed or things that I've skipped over, but that's a really great insight.
Cool.
After you get past kind of like, assessment and say, like, let's say I get range and I have, articulation and nothing seems to be deficient. What's your concept about, first and foremost, training let's suppose that let's just talk about the medical kind of recommendations. So let's say I'm past the medical recommendations. Their requirements for passing those are below average. And so let's just say those are addressed. And, essentially at 8 weeks, I can start contracting the muscle, which I think is a mistake. Just, between, not a mistake, but I think that's a mistake to be the focus. I think the focus should be probably on isometrics and ramping. But from your perspective, let's say I've reached all of the requirements medically. What would you look at if you just said, okay, that there was tissue damage, it was pinned, bolted, whatever, but that thing should have had a long enough chance to regrab and regrow. But now we really need to put inputs into that tissue. What would be your approach after the assessment and after the kind of the basic stuff that we just covered?
Totally. Yeah. So if you've reached the point of like loading is possible now, I think the assessing with movement and starting at low level loading, even passively, and just looking at all of the angles of that bicep tendon and what it feels like. So I would, the easiest way would be I would put the bicep into its lengthened position. So elbow extension.
Yeah.
And then I would play with passively stretching that in all of the angles of pronation to supination and just see, what does it feel like? I mean, classically you might feel the most tension when you're supinated, but maybe it's when you're pronated. It very much depends.
Yeah.
Maybe it's some weird angle in the middle where you're like, that actually feels the most acute. If I could find an angle where something felt very acute, I would want to focus on that for a while and probably live in the passive stretching and low intensity isometrics, low intensity, longer duration.
Yeah.
Progressive wise, I would, I kind of like, I don't want to have hard borders between these, like isometric, explore all of the isometrics before we go to eccentrics. But what I like to do generally is ramp the isometrics where we're increasing intensity and lowering duration. And for that kind of isometric, my hope would be like at some point, I want to be able to get a 10-second, 100% maximal effort isometric on that, just to check that box off. Just say, yes, we can ramp this loading up to a maximal effort that's so intense that you just can't maintain that level of force internally for more than 10 seconds. I think that's a good check mark. Along those lines, I would probably start introducing some slower, lower intensity eccentrics. But once we get, we kind of overlap those, I want to get towards loading heavy eccentrics, but slowly applied eccentrics.
Yeah.
And again, I would want to, I would want to know if there's any differences there. Like you might have some angles of elbow extension that feel totally normal, but you might have that one specific angle where you get to a certain point and all of a sudden you experience that tension's going up, strain is going up, and then you get a big jump in that. Like I would want to very much focus on trying to even that out so we can get through that particular range and keep that more on a 45 gradual increasing thing. But once we get to the point, like let's say we've gone all the way through the isometrics, now we've worked through eccentrics, and you're able to do a maximal eccentric, like, something like overload your bicep and do a really slow controlled eccentric and actually control that into your full elbow extension. Now we can go back with the speed stuff. And I would go back into the isometric land of that, like, let's do some ballistic isometrics on that, where it's more of an internal contraction, but we're trying to ramp up to a pretty high intensity. Does that feel good? Okay, cool. We've gotten to the point where we can do that. Let's try to take that up to maximal, like where you're, however you want to do it, blocking your elbow so it can't flex, and then doing truly maximal where you're yanking against something, and maybe we're doing that in full elbow extension, or maybe it is more relative to that angle that the injury happened in, but something along those lines. progressing that towards like we get all the way to the overspeed eccentric where it's, you know, high intensity and very rapid loading.
Mhm.
That's the spectrum that I would want to go along, you know, and thinking about how long it takes connective tissue to adapt. I mean, I think the majority of your training time is going to be on that earlier stage, like isometric, eccentric stuff. Once you get to the point of doing the faster high intensity loading, I think you need that in really small doses to make it work well, right? Like it's obviously very intense. It's probably going to cause more tissue damage. We want to be mindful of the volume with that stuff, but that's kind of the general progression.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I was a little bit, I would say, hesitant to know where to place like purely muscle contractions within trying to pay attention to the connective tissue. But I think you're right. Connective tissue is such a longer arc for recovery, and it's so much more sensitive to high input that I think we don't need. I think one of the mistakes that I would say I made, and maybe other people fall for this too, is like once you figure out you can train connective tissue, you're like, oh, and you kind of like overdo it. Like anything, you're just like, I'm excited that this is a new thing. And if you're obsessive with training like we obviously are, I want to play with this concept and see how it can make me better. And I think like training, you get into CrossFit and you overdo it. You get into weightlifting, you overdo it. And you basically have to bump up against the wall before you're like, okay, I got it. I can back off a little bit. So you're thinking about it very, very closely to how I would. This is just, obviously from my personal insight, but I think it's just such a interesting process. One, I think healing something really allows you to understand the fundamentals of biology, right? It's really like ground zero, and therefore it's not discouraging to me. I mean, I wish I could roll right now. That's the only thing, because I can't control the force, so I can't be exposed to it for re-rupture. That's the only thing that really discourages me from an injury, is like I wish I could do the activities that I love. But that aside, training is just as interesting. Like I show up every day, and instead of trying to figure out other problems, I'm just figuring out this problem. And so that has been an alleviation. That tends to be like what I want to gear people. I want to gear them towards, like, there's a ton of reasons to be bummed about getting injured. But really, if you're a real student of like fitness, physiology, and you really want to be able to move around functionally for your lifetime, man, injuries are really good proving ground. Like how you handle it, how you tolerate, all of that stuff. So I really appreciate you taking the time. What other things are you interested in right now? What are you working on yourself?
Well, training wise, I mean, I still, as a 42-year-old, am so dictated by my ego. Like my ego is like, it's amazing how much influence that still has on my training. So I definitely still have like the feats of strength component. I really like that. I want to have muscle. I want to look like I work out, like, and those are all totally ego driven. And I think at this point I've realized that that's never going to go away.
Yeah.
The nice thing about especially doing the ISM stuff is that I've realized that like I need to do way less of it to still make progress and actually feel good. I think where we've messaged a little bit about this before, but like the jiu-jitsu thing has really taken a large priority in like the survival aspect of it. Like not surviving just in the role, but like how do I keep going to jiu-jitsu 3 days a week and still trying to keep this feats of strength stuff up and just have my body not completely disintegrate? I really underestimated how much of my mental training capacity that would take up. Like that's really probably the biggest slice of the pie right now, is like figure out what makes my body feel better and still roll hard. That's
I mean, it's taken, how long have you been doing jiu-jitsu? A couple of years now?
Yeah, I started in March of 2023, so it's been a little over 2 years. I did a competition this weekend, my first competition as a blue belt. And it was rough. Like I got a little knee tweak. I had like a little back spasm yesterday, and I got on Saturday. I was like, I think I'm all right. Like I survived. I'm really sore. Like I worked out, and then yesterday I got in bed and I was like, oh no, this is like I'm reliving 10 years ago. Like I bent over to pick something up, and my back was like, nope. and it
Oh
really
man.
totally caught me off guard. But that's
Well,
how it
your
goes.
weight class, yeah, your weight class and the rank is really going to play a role in it. And to be fair, I might argue blue belt is one of the roughest physical competitions you can do because of the uncontrolled nature of, you never know what you're going to get. And plus, if you're a big guy, man, if you're over 200 pounds, 208 or whatever you're at, it's who you get is probably somebody who has physically always been very dominant and they're very insecure because of their rank, so they kind of amplify one to make up for the other, and you can get a whirlwind of spasm like people, and just avoiding injury is the win. You know what I mean? Like, don't get injured and you've done a great job. Once you get to purple belt, people tend to chill out a little bit. They're like, they're not worried anymore about fighting for their life, so it does get better. Competing at a blue belt was never fun for me. It was like, I think that was one. It made me not like competition quite a bit, and I love competing, but I haven't been able to do much of it. Obviously, that's pretty phenomenal. The the concepts that I've been working on, and I would say, like, I say this quite often, that FRC is like quite literally designed for jiu-jitsu, right? It's like it addresses all of the issues that jiu-jitsu has not figured out yet in supportive training for jiu-jitsu. And I've gone down, quite a few rabbit holes. I had a really good podcast with, do you follow Raspberry Ape?
Oh yeah, I
Daniel,
love that dude.
dude's great. And he just has so much insight on the history of grappling. Like, he's just a fan of everything, and like everything he's into, he knows so much about. And he really talked about that, strength training and grappling have just been entangled for all of history. You go back to the original, like some of the first paintings or depictions of training that we had were like these Chinese military training scrolls where they're showing wrestling with like sandbag lifting, and then the Egyptians wrestling and like lifting what looks like a primitive kind of clean and jerk with like a bell of some sort. And this is fascinating because you get to where Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu started to be marketed in the US, and they really like tried to separate strength and conditioning because it needed to be about being small. Like, the small guy had to have an opportunity. So one of the reasons that they had Hoist go in instead of Hickson to the UFC. First of all, they thought Hickson was going to kill somebody because he's like a monster. And Hoist was like, he represented the brand. He was a small guy and he didn't look threatening. You see Hickson, he's muscular. He's, doesn't really work.
Totally.
So they did such good marketing about saying that this, doesn't have anything to do with strength and conditioning, that 30 years later, we're seeing the impact of that disassociation of supportive training for it. You don't see that in wrestling. You don't see it in any other sport. I mean, it's all a part of the same system. And I think, sadly enough, this is my take on it, and I think you're probably similar because we kind of have similar views on this origin thing of the traditional training. But like Russian, like seeing what the personal trainer gives to like a 65-year-old lady these days, on average, is depressing, because you're like, why are you doing 5x5s? It's not that it's bad. It's just that when I see that, I know there's no other insight. And what we've done, and I explain this to other people, especially with like jiu-jitsu, is like you're back squatting and deadlifting to support jiu-jitsu, right? That's like me playing tennis to get faster at jiu-jitsu. You're like, it doesn't make any sense. You're like, there's some crossover, but the danger of the crossover is that the compound lift that most people do, which are they're really trying to get at like general strength adaptations, they are so systemic, like you can't do both. There's not enough room in the physiology or the biology of a single person to train at meaningful levels for jiu-jitsu and skill development, and develop the skill and prerequisites that are required for deadlifting and cleaning and jerking or whatever. You might get somebody who has done that stuff in the past, and the crossover is pretty easy. They have nothing to learn, so they might have some success with it. That's usually what I see. People lift weights in the high school, like weight room, playing football, whatever. They do bodybuilding, and then they get into jiu-jitsu later. They know how to do those things, so that's the first thing that they attach to. And logically, like I did some trade with Hodger Gracie a long back in 2016. Who reintroduced me to jiu-jitsu. So I was training for a guy for a movie in London. He wanted to do jiu-jitsu. I had played with it for years previous, and I didn't like it. I liked Muay Thai. I liked MMA, but I did not like jiu-jitsu on its own. I thought it was lame. I was like, I just don't want to roll around on the ground. And I was like, but I know enough about it. I'll go be your training partner. And he's like, yeah, let's just get somebody good. So I asked around, hey, who's good at jiu-jitsu here? And they're like, Hodger. And I'm like, well, yeah, but he's
Sure,
like,
he's good.
Yeah, he's like, he's pretty good. So somebody was like, oh, his father is roommates with my friend. I was like, oh, you're serious? Like, we just go get a private from Hodger? He's like, yeah, I'll ask him. So he said, yeah, let's do it. So that was my first kind of exposure back to jiu-jitsu. And he found out what I did for like, we're very well known for conditioning, and like we could get into some crazy schemes for developing fitness for some people. And he's like, oh, I'd like to come like experience a session. So he gave me privates for jiu-jitsu for like 6 months, and he'd come in and do these, insane. He was still prepping for MMA at the time, and we'd exchange this. I gotta say, although like at the time I didn't know I was having him lift weights and what, I watched him pull a weight, and I was like, he doesn't need to lift weights. He's like incredibly strong, like just one of the most natural expressions of strength that I think I've ever seen. And somebody said that he deadlifted. I don't know if this is true, but I was talking to somebody about it, and they go, oh yeah, the first time he deadlifted like 500 pounds. And I was like, what? Okay. I guess it makes sense when you see him. He's just such an amazing athlete. It's like incredible. And it makes sense to me. But once I saw that, I was like, I think people that are naturally gifted at lifting and then do jiu-jitsu and then combine them, they confuse a lot of people about it. Absolutely. My approach to it has been how to get hyper specific about the requirements for jiu-jitsu. And I think you're probably working on the same thing, which is, putting it together.
Yeah. I mean, you said this earlier, like, I think this one thing alone can really start to change everybody's perspective. Is just thinking about what is strength, like what's happening. If I can pick up a big heavy bar off the ground, like we think that picking up the heavy bar off the ground is the training to do that. And obviously if you do that enough, you get better at doing it, but we're not thinking about what the cost of that is. And I think, like everybody's like, yeah, build muscle. Like there's only a positive. It's a net positive when you build muscle. Yeah. Like, if we look at this little aspect of our human existence, there is a net positive. Like, sure, it's good for metabolism. It's good to have some muscle mass. It's great for aging. What's the cost of doing that over and over again and not doing anything else? Well, the cost is that I'm telling my body that little bit of stuff is the priority, and that other shit out here is expendable.
Yeah.
And, thinking of strength as an organization of the stuff. And so if we want to organize the stuff, making sure the stuff is there, like that's the training, right? And like, still, again, going back to my ego-driven training thing, like I'm amazed at how much actual strength training I've been able to take away and still make progress on strength training while cultivating the stuff that actually makes me feel better and survive jiu-jitsu. I see it all the time. I see these really talented coaches. They're good at jiu-jitsu. They have good programs. They're like, here's my jiu-jitsu athlete, and this is what I'm having him do while he's in competition for jiu-jitsu. And I'm like, let me guess, it's going to be deadlifts, it's going to be squats, it's going to be some bench press. And then it's like, I have him do some bench press, and we're just mindful of the loading. And I'm like, but yeah, like that dude's Zercher squatting 450. He's in a weight class in jiu-jitsu. He weighs 190 pounds. Like, that's dope. I'm so impressed. I think that's awesome. And I love heavy Zercher squats. So that's cool that he can do it. But like, what are you doing for the guy's lumbar spine? What are you doing for his neck? What are you doing for his hip joint? Like that. I mean, there's that. There's also just the fact that, you in jiu-jitsu, out of all the things, like I really can't think of any other physical activity that you could do where you're asking your joints to do so much stuff. Like you really get exposed to some extreme ranges of motion that are not getting touched by regular exercises.
No.
I always use this. I say the same story all the time. So I'm sorry if you've heard me say it somewhere like on Instagram, but like the thing for my own body that was the biggest revelation was when we got into FRC, I realized like I was just lacking in a lot of qualities that I probably needed to make this strength training thing sustainable. And I kept hurting my back doing lame stuff in my shoulder. And I just like, I did the thing that I tell people to never do, which is I gave up on strength training. I just stopped. I was like, I'm just going to do FRC stuff. I'm just going to try to fix my right hip and my low back and just deal with this shit because I'm tired of constantly being afraid of hurting myself. And so I take a year off lifting. I lost like 15 pounds roughly. I was trying to eat healthy. I was trying to do some cardio, but I was just doing joint specific training, no lifting. After a year, I was like, man, I feel really good. Like my body just feels ready to do stuff. I'm just going to start doing some lifting. I'm just going to see what happens. And we hadn't gone to ISM yet. So I just figured I'm just going to do like 1 day of squats instead of 3 days a week of squats. I'm going to deadlift 1 day a week, and I'm going to try to press 1 day a week. And I'm just going to do whatever the fuck I feel like for a couple sets. I'm going to have just very much like just check the box off. You did a squat today. And in 6 weeks of squatting, I beat my lifetime PR back squatting at 15 pounds less body weight. And I was squatting 1 day a week. And I mean like 2 sets of squats. I was like, this must be a fluke. Let's see what happens on the deadlift. Like 8 weeks of deadlifting, deadlift PR, overhead press, PR. And I was like, that's insane. Like up to this point, I've lifted for 20 years with the mindset of if I don't squat 3 days a week, I'm going to get weaker at squatting. And I just took a year off and I beat my lifetime squat, like at less body weight. And then then it was like, all right, I'm on board 100%, but it's funny to think about that. But I encounter that a lot. There's so many people who are doing all this stuff and they want to be strong and they know that that's part of their sport is having some physical strength, but the fear of losing stuff. Like I think about us trying to market this stuff and in general, marketing, like the way I feel about this, and I think the experience that I've had with other people, in my mind, I'm like, it's so crazy that more people aren't seeking this out and doing it. Like in my mind, I don't get why everybody isn't doing it, but I think there's a lot more thought that has to go into it. There's a lot more of you experiencing it in your own body. And that's something that, like I said before, I realized all the years I've been working out, it was really like, did I do this number of reps and sets at this percentage? Yes, I did. I trained today. I never thought about what it felt like. There was no more depth to it than that for me for a really long time.
Yeah.
And then I realized how much depth there could be. And I think that's what's holding a lot of people back is like just that I'm afraid to lose stuff. I'm not willing to feel all this out. It's funny.
Yeah. It's fun. I mean, you say it now, and I had I was trained 2 and 3 times a day for years on end. I was maxing out on front squat at least once a week. And like, I maxed out on clean and jerk probably every day for like months on end. It's like, I loved it. Like I loved the feeling of it. But I was also under the grind, work hard, everybody else's lazy mindset. And I talked about this actually before I even found FRC, which is like, there is something called lazy strength where like, I meet a guy, he goes to the gym, gets his protein shake, warms up for 15 seconds on the elliptical, and then he'll do like, a set of 3 bench press and then like talk to somebody. And then he'll just, and he's like strong, stronger than I'll ever be,
Yeah.
And that always frustrated me. But I really think about it now conceptually, listening to you describe that is like, we compare accommodation to like, interest rate a lot of the time. Like the more you spend, the higher the interest rate gets. And that a lot of like strength training is first sold as you just got to do it more. And that's not necessarily true. And when people do less of it, it's almost like you got to think about a strength training, I think, is depositing, right? It's like you're doing a little strength session, you're paying attention to your joint, you're ramping up that contraction rate. I really think that is like putting credit into your bank account. When you do a strength expression where you're like maxing out or you're trying something to see how good you are at it, that's kind of like a debit. And then by the time, it's like, if you compare the two, if you take your scenario where you're like, man, I went from training 3 days a week or squatting 3 days a week to 1 day a week, it's like somebody only depositing into the bank account, and after a year being like, oh my God, I have a lot of money. Like, you're like, well, yeah, you haven't been charging anything. Like, of course you do. You're like, no, like a lot of money. I'm like really strong. And you're like, yeah, you just been putting so much into the system and you haven't let it out. We talk, Dewey is like very kind of anti-woo stuff.
Sure.
But he even admitted this, because this is one of the first things that I ever felt from doing the difference between maximal contraction rate on, like, let's say a deadlift, or maximal contraction rate in the form of like a pale and rail, or some kind of isometric contraction or whatever. He kind of acknowledged it in passing. I don't know what it is. Maybe there's something to it. There's something very different from taking all of my energy and directing it externally, or taking all of my energy and directing it internally. You do not feel, well, when, and it's not like I don't deadlift anymore, but when you deadlift, you're like kind of wiped out. Like, I just like, the rest of the day is kind of shot. My nervous system just got what it came for. But I do pails and rails or something like that, and I'm really giving it 100% contraction. I feel better, right? Like, I feel like ramped up. I put energy and focus into my internal system, and maybe it's just not leaving, the enclosed system. That's fascinating to me. And I don't think it all can be like that, because eventually you're going to have to put your energy externally. That being said, I agree with you on, like, as far as the marketing goes, man, it's really hard to understand why people don't want to feel good or move well or do whatever. And you're like, honestly, though, it is the thinking component that drives most people away. Like, I know that just based off of the stuff that I do, I'm not for everybody. I'm like rabbit hole, and I go way too deep, and I require way too much attention. You're never going to see me list the 5 top exercises to fix your back. So like,
Yes.
and that's how, this is where I think sport has really tricked people. It's tricked them into thinking that there is just an algorithm that gets them X. And in reality, it's like, you couldn't do that for any subject that fitness is so important, like to how your brain functions, to how you feel about yourself, to your relationships, to your experiences. It's on the same level of picking, like, what career to do, or, what to do for work, how to choose a mate, how to, like, it's like, these are like the top subjects in a human's life. And if you take any of the top subjects, if you ever saw a list of how to accomplish it, you would laugh. Like, the top 5 things to do to find your true love, you'd be like, okay, like, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, you're like, do these 5 exercises to find meaningful work, and you'd be like, this doesn't make any sense.
Totally.
I think fitness has been put into a category, and it's kind of been like shoved down so as not to be made as important, and it's been very superficial. And you talk about the egocentric side of it, as in, like, I want to be dude, I don't know if I would call that ego.
No,
I would no, I don't, like, as ego as in sense of self, but I don't separate these two. And I would say your sense of self, your identity, comes from kind of the energy you put into, like, who you are. And when I look at the spectrum, of endurance work to strength work, power, all of these expressions that we have physically kind of have personality correlates to them. Like that.
Sure.
That's like, I'll use bodybuilding for an example. Not that it's like a great example, but I think people will most likely get this. Okay. A lot of bodybuilders, or you've met them and you're aware, right? So you see Arnold, and he is like the epitome of self-confidence. Now, where did that self-confidence come from? Like, first, I guess you have to define what confidence means, right? Self-confidence is essentially, I would define it as like your expression built off of known outcomes, right? Like, I do something so many times that I know it's going to turn out this way. Right. And therefore, when you look at bodybuilding, how many reps is somebody doing that they know the outcome, right? Like, their confidence is quite literally a emotional and, I would say, psychological manifestation of the physical attribute of what the muscle is going through. And it moves so many times that it changes into something that represents who they are. And therefore, you lift enough weights repetitively that your body changes shape, and then people just start to recognize your confidence. It already exists. Now, you take that and you don't balance it correctly, or you cut it short, or and I'm not against it. Don't I'm not saying it's bad or good, but you take, known exogenous chemicals that help build it. You're actually cutting into the process of building your own self-confidence. It's false self-confidence. Now, I think that hypertrophy, that strength endurance signal, sits right next to the strength signal. And what I see is you have kind of a mixture of people. You cut in half. People either focus only on bodybuilding, and then they never apply it. They never become so sensitive to the top end expression that they lack the aggression, and it's just pure kind of narcissism to a certain degree. It's unbalanced. Or people aim, they get like really angry, and they're like angry teenagers that listen to metal in their basement, and they're like, I'm a power lifter. And then, and then they never do the supportive self-confidence work that is required for maximal expression. And with either of those fall apart, you have like identity crisis. And when I look at it, I go, all of these physical energetic systems, they kind of have correlates to them. To me, that's what I'm training. Like I like the muscles and the ability, they're kind of a side effect of, I want self-confidence. I want to be sensitive. I want to be able to be aggressive. I want trust in the system, which is like discipline. Trust is kind of like the endurance correlate, where if I discipline myself to do something longer and longer, I get this ability to trust what I'm able to do. Now, when that gets unbalanced, you see what becomes of ultra runners, when they unbalance the system. And then the aerobic, like the maximal capacity system, is just this really interesting one that I've gone down wormholes with, because I was fascinated with the sensations of hard training, like hard, intense training. That's probably the most fascinating subject to me. And what I noticed from it is that you have two kind of concepts that come out of that. The first one is creativity, which is, it sounds strange, but if you put your brain into like kind of a less than 80% effort and not high skill set between 2 or 3 different movements, and you go for longer than 35 minutes but less than 60, the brain chemistry that comes out of that is highly correlative to problem solving. And you're not exhausted. So I found this on accident because I was writing about the subject on capacity. And in order to I just noticed that if I trained in the morning and did like this 45-minute kind of like couplet or triplet with a sandbag and a step over and a machine, that I could go and write literally for like 5 hours nonstop. And I would just dump and it was just the most creative I've ever been. Well, I noticed that quit working because I kept doing that. And when I went to go edit the book, I would go to I would erase a sentence and then I would write 12 more. And I was like, oh, I got to change that. Like I'm too creative. So I started doing hard intervals. Now, why do we call it conditioning? Because it cuts away, right? It removes something. And so when you do hard conditioning, so I started moving to like 7x3 minute intervals, VO2 max intervals, lactic thresholds. I was able to go and chop 50% of what I had written over the past like 6 months and really edit it down. And I was like, I'm not even exercising for fitness. I'm literally changing my behavior based off of what I do in the gym. And I was like,
that's so cool.
Why are we talking about VO2 max? No one gives a shit. Like, Peter Attila right now is like, oh, you need to see this VO2 max metric. Nobody cares. But if Orange Theory started having a 10 a.m. self-confidence class where they did some bodybuilding, and then at 11:30 they had like a creativity class, I think people would be like, wait, what can you do with fitness? Like, this seems like it's actually applicable. I'm not just like getting lean for my wedding.
Right. Oh man, that's beautiful. You just gave me so many crazy insights that just marinated in there from all that last part there. That was excellent.
Awesome. I've been working on a little. I mean, I've been obviously trying to go back. I mean, this is the ideas that I'm trying to embed into strength and these energetic systems, and obviously incorporate FRC. It's kind of what I've been working on for the past couple of years. So it's really come. It's only been able to come out because I'm not broken. This is like the beauty of finding your stuff, finding a lot of the other people that led us to FRC and all of these like really insightful methodologies that allow us to keep doing fitness. That's what opened the road. I think if I would be such a cynic if my shoulder was still broken and I didn't, if I wasn't able to participate in fitness, my whole life would fall apart. And and I think a lot of people that has happened to them. So I agree with you. I'd love to get this like methodology more well known, because I do think there's deeper things to discover in fitness. And I want to be mindful of your time, man. I really appreciate you.
Of course, man. No, this is excellent. I could go on forever. That's
totally. And we'll have to do it again. We'll have to do it again for sure. If I can edit this and put it out on a podcast if you want, because I think it's great. I think people would really like to hear your point of view and whatnot. Give people a place to go to and check out your stuff. Where's your gym located? How can they find out more about you?
My Instagram handle is Strange Grayson, and it's the first profile pic that I ever had on Instagram. It's my dog wearing sunglasses, which I just feel like I can't ever change now. So it is me if you see a dog wearing sunglasses.
Nice.
The name of our business is Basis Health and Performance New York. We're in Saratoga Springs, New York. We have a studio at our house, and we do online training. And just Google that. You'll find us.
Dude, awesome. It was really great to talk to you.
Likewise, man. It was a pleasure.